Hello and welcome to day 1 of Topher Reads The Hobbit. I chose this story because it's about a character who is quite reluctant to leave home and then, well, he does, and has a grand adventure. We're all sort of stuck in our houses right now, unable to go out and find our own adventures, so I thought this was a good choice. Anyway, I hope you enjoy it as much as I do. So, let's begin. The Hobbit, Chapter 1, An Unexpected Party. In a hole in the ground there lived a hobbit. Not a nasty, dirty, wet hole filled with the ends of worms and an oozy smell, nor yet a dry, bare, sandy hole with nothing in it to sit down on or to eat. It was a hobbit hole, and that means comfort. It had a perfectly round door like a porthole. It was painted green with a shiny yellow brass knob in the exact middle. The door opened onto a tube-shaped hall like a tunnel. A very comfortable tunnel without smoke, with paneled walls and floors tiled and carpeted, provided with polished chairs and lots of pegs for hats and coats. The hobbit was fond of visitors. The tunnel wound on, going fairly but not quite straight into the side of the hill. The hill, as all the people for many miles round called it, had many little round doors that opened up out of it, first on one side and then on the other. There was no going upstairs for the hobbit. Bedrooms, bathrooms, cellars, pantries, there were a lot of pantries, wardrobes, now he had whole rooms devoted to clothing. Kitchens, dining rooms, all of these were on the same floor, and indeed on the same passage. The best rooms were all on the left-hand side going in, for these were the only ones to have windows, deep-set round windows looking over his garden and meadows beyond, sloping down into the river. This hobbit was a very well-to-do hobbit, and his name was Baggins. Now the Bagginses had lived in the neighborhood of the hill for time out of mind, and people considered them very respectable, not only because most of them were rich, but also because they never had any adventures or did anything unexpected. You could tell what a Baggins would say on any question without even the bother of asking him. This is a story of how a Baggins had an adventure, and found himself doing and saying things altogether unexpected. He may have lost the neighbors' respect, but he gained, well, you will see whether he gained anything in the end. The mother of our particular hobbit. Now, what is a hobbit? I suppose hobbits need some description nowadays, since they have become rare and shy of the big people, as they call us. They are, or were, a little people, about half our height and smaller than the bearded dwarves. Hobbits have no beards. There is little or no magic about hobbits, except the ordinary everyday sort which helps them to disappear quietly and quickly when large stupid folk like you and me come blundering along, making a noise like elephants, which they can hear a mile off. They are inclined to be fat in the stomach. They dress in bright colors, chiefly green and yellow. They wear no shoes, because their feet grow leathery natural soles and thick, warm brown hair like the stuff on their heads, which is curly. They have long, clever brown fingers, good-natured faces, and a laugh that is deep and fruity, especially after dinner, which they have twice a day when they can get it. Now you know enough about hobbits to go on with. As I was saying, the mother of this hobbit, of Bilbo Baggins that is, was the famous Belladonna Took, one of the 3 remarkable daughters of the Old Took, the head of the hobbits who lived across the water, which was the small river that ran at the foot of the hill. It was often said in other families that long ago one of the Took ancestors must have taken a fairy wife. That was, of course, absurd. But certainly there was still something not entirely hobbit-like about the Tooks. and once in a while members of the Took clan would go and have adventures. They would discreetly disappear, and then the family would hush it up. But the fact remained that the Tooks were not as respectable as the Bagginses, though the Tooks were undoubtedly richer. Now, it's not that Belladonna Took ever had any adventures after she became Bungo Baggins' wife. Bungo, that was Bilbo's father, built the most luxurious hobbit hole for her, partly with her money. But it was the most wonderful hobbit hole that was ever to be found on either side of the hill, or over the hill, or across the water. And there they remain to the end of their days. Still, it is probable that Bilbo, her only son, although he looked and behaved exactly like a second edition of his solid and comfortable father, got something a bit queer in his makeup from his Took side. Something that only waited for a chance to come out. But the chance never arrived until Bilbo Baggins was grown up, being about 50 years old or so, and living in the beautiful hobbit hole built by his father, which I have just described for you, and until he had in fact apparently settled down immovably. By some curious chance one morning, long ago in the quiet of the world, when there was less noise and more green, and the hobbits were still numerous and prosperous, Bilbo Baggins was standing at his door after breakfast, smoking an enormous long wooden pipe that reached nearly down to his woolly toes that were neatly brushed. It was this morning that Gandalf came by. Gandalf. If you had heard only a quarter of what I have heard about him, and I have only heard very little of all there is to hear, you would be prepared for any sort of remarkable tale. Tales and adventures sprouted up all over the place wherever he went, and in the most extraordinary fashion. He had not been down that way under the hill for ages and ages, not since his friend the old Took died, in fact, and the hobbits had almost forgotten what he looked like. He had been away over the hill and across the water on businesses of his own since they were all small hobbit boys and hobbit girls. All that the unsuspecting Bilbo saw that morning was an old man with a staff. He had a tall, pointed blue hat, a long gray cloak, a silver scarf over which his long white beard hung down below his waist, and immense black boots. "Good morning," said Bilbo, and he meant it. The sun was shining, and the grass was very green. But Gandalf looked at him from under long bushy eyebrows that stuck out further than the brim of his shady hat. "And what do you mean?" he said. "Do you wish me a good morning, or mean that it is a good morning whether I want it or not? Or that you feel good this morning? Or that it is a morning to be good on?" All of them at once, I suppose. And a very fine morning for a pipe of tobacco out of doors into the bargain. If you have a pipe about you, sit down and have a fill of mine. There's no hurry, we have all the day before us." And then Bilbo sat down on a seat by his door, he crossed his legs, and blew out a beautiful grey ring of smoke that sailed up into the air without breaking and floated away over the hill. "Very pretty," said Gandalf, "but I have no time to blow smoke rings this morning. I am looking for someone to share an adventure that I am arranging, and it is very difficult to find anyone." "Well, I should think so in these parts. We are a plain quiet folk and have no use for adventures. Nasty, disturbing, uncomfortable things. Make you late for dinner. I can't think of what anybody sees in them." And our Mr. Baggins stuck one thumb behind his braces and blew out another even bigger smoke ring. And then he took out his morning letters and began to read, pretending to take no more notice of the old man. He had decided that he was not quite his sort, and he wanted him to go away. But the old man did not move. He stood leaning on his stick and gazing at the hobbit without saying anything, until Bilbo got quite uncomfortable and even a little cross. "Good morning," he said at last. "We don't want any adventures here, thank you. You might try over the hill or across the water." And by this he meant that the conversation was at an end. "What a lot of things you do use good morning for," said Gandalf. "Now you mean that you want to be rid of me, and it won't be good until I move on." Not at all, my dear sir. Now let me see, I don't think I know your name." Yes, my dear sir, and I do know your name, Mr. Bilbo Baggins, and you do know my name, though you don't remember that I belong to it. I am Gandalf, and Gandalf means me. To think that I should have lived to be good morning by Belladonna Took's son as if I was selling buttons at the door. Gandalf, good gracious me, not the wandering wizard that gave old Took a pair of magic diamond studs that fastened themselves and never came undone until ordered. Not the fellow who used to tell such wonderful tales at the parties about dragons and goblins and giants and the rescue of princesses and the unexpected luck of widows' sons. Not the man who used to make such particularly excellent fireworks. Oh, I remember those. Old Took used to have them on Midsummer's Eve. Splendid! They used to go up like great lilies and snapdragons and laburnums of fire and hang in the twilight all evening. You will notice already that Mr. Baggins was not quite so prosy as he liked to believe. And also, he was very fond of flowers. Dear me! Not the Gandalf who was responsible for so many quiet lads and lasses going off into the blue for mad adventures. Anything from climbing trees to visiting elves or sailing in ships, sailing to other shores. Bless me, life used to be quite interesting. I mean, you used to upset things badly in these parts once upon a time. I beg your pardon, but I had no idea you were still in business? "And where else should I be?" said the wizard. "All the same, I am pleased to find you remember something about me. You seem to remember my fireworks kindly, at any rate, and that is not without hope. Indeed, for your old grandfather Took's sake, and for the sake of poor Belladonna, I will give you what you asked for." "I beg your pardon, I haven't asked for anything." Yes, you have, twice now. My pardon, I give it to you. In fact, I will go so far as to send you on this adventure. Very amusing for me, and very good for you. And profitable, too, very likely, if you ever get over it. "Sorry, we don't want any adventures around here, thank you. Not today, good morning. But please come to tea, any time you like. Why not tomorrow? Yes, come tomorrow. Goodbye." And with that the hobbit turned and scuttled inside his round green door and shut it as quickly as he dared. Not to seem rude, but wizards, after all, are wizards. "What on earth did I ask him to tea for?" he said to himself as he went to the pantry. He'd only just had breakfast, but he thought a cake or two and a drink of something would do him good after this fright. Gandalf, in the meantime, was still standing outside the door and laughing long but quietly. And after a while he stepped up, and with the spike on the end of his staff he scratched a queer sign on the hobbit's beautiful green front door. And then he strode away, just about the time when Bilbo was finishing his second cake and beginning to think that he had escaped adventures very well. The next day he had almost forgotten about Gandalf. He did not remember things very well unless he put them down in his engagement tablet, like Gandalf, tea, Wednesday. Yesterday he had been a bit too flustered to do anything of the kind. And just before tea time there came a tremendous ring on the front door bell, and then he remembered. He rushed and put on the kettle, and put out another cup and a saucer and an extra cake or two, and he ran to the door. "I am sorry to keep you waiting," he was going to say, when he saw that it was not Gandalf at all. It was a dwarf, with a blue beard tucked into a golden belt, and very bright eyes under his dark green hood. As soon as the door was opened, the dwarf pushed inside just as if he had been expected. He hung his hooded cloak on the nearest peg, and "Dwalin, at your service," he said, with a low bow. Bilbo Baggins at yours," said the hobbit, too surprised to ask any questions for the moment. When the silence that followed had become a bit uncomfortable, he added, "I am just about to take tea. Pray, come have some with me." He was a bit stiff in this, perhaps, but he meant it kindly. "And what would you do if an uninvited dwarf came and hung his things up in your hall without a word of explanation?" They had not been at the table long, and in fact they had hardly reached the third cake when there came another even louder ring at the bell. "Oh, excuse me," said the hobbit, and off he went to the door. So you have got here at last." That was what he was going to say to Gandalf this time, but it was not Gandalf. Instead, there was a very old-looking dwarf on the step with a white beard and a scarlet hood, and he too hopped inside just as soon as the door was open, as if he had been invited. "I see they have begun to arrive already," he said when he caught sight of Dwalin's green hood hanging up. He hung his red hood up next to it, and said, "Balin, at your service," he said with his hand on his breast. "Thank you," Bilbo said. It was not the correct thing to say, but "they have begun to arrive" had flustered him badly. He liked visitors, but he liked to know his visitors before they arrived, and he preferred to ask them to arrive himself. He had a horrible thought that the cakes might run short, and then he, as the host, knowing his duty and sticking to it however painful, that he might have to go without for himself. "Come along, then, and have some tea," he managed to say after a deep breath. "A little beer would suit me better if it's all the same to you, my good sir," said Balin with the white beard. "But I don't mind some cake. Seed cake, if you have any." "Oh, lots," Bilbo found himself answering, and to his own surprise, and he found himself scuttling off, too, to the cellar to fill a pint beer mug, and then to a pantry to fetch 2 beautiful round seed cakes which he had baked that afternoon for his after-supper morsel. When he got back, Balin and Dwalin were talking at the table like old friends, and as a matter of fact, they were brothers. Bilbo plumped down the beer and the cake in front of them, and when loudly came a ring at the bell again, and then another ring. That is Gandalf for certain this time," he thought as he puffed along the passage. But it was not. It was 2 more dwarves, both with blue hoods, silver belts, and yellow beards, and each of them carried a bag of tools and a spade. In they hopped just as soon as the door began to open, only now Bilbo was hardly surprised at all. "And what can I do for you, my dwarves?" he asked. "Kille, at your service," said one. "And Fili," added the other, and they both swept off their blue hoods and bowed. "At yours and your families," replied Bilbo, remembering his manners this time. "Dwalin and Balin are here already, I see," said Kili. "Let us join the throng." "Throng?" thought Mr. Baggins. "I don't like the sound of that. I really must sit down for a minute and collect my wits and have a drink." He had only just had a sip in the corner while the 4 dwarfs sat around the table. They talked about mines and gold and troubles with the goblins and the depredations of dragons and lots of other things which he did not understand and did not want to, for they sounded much too adventurous, when suddenly, ding-dong-a-ling-dang, his bell rang again, as if some naughty little hobbit boy was trying to pull the handle off. "Someone at the door," he said, blinking. "Some 4, I should say, by the sound," said Fili. "Besides, we saw them coming along behind us in the distance." The poor little hobbit sat down in the hall and put his head to his hands and wondered what had happened and what was going to happen, and whether they would all stay to supper. And then the bell rang again, louder than ever, and he had to run to the door. And it was not 4, after all, it was 5. Another dwarf had come along while he was wandering in the hall. He had hardly turned the knob before they were all inside, bowing and saying, "At your service," one after another. And there stood Dory, Nori, Ori, Oin, and Gloin. And very soon two purple hoods, a grey hood, a brown hood, and a white hood were hanging on the pegs, and off they marched with the broad hands stuck in their gold and silver belts to join the others. Already it had almost become a throng. Some called for ale, some for porter, and one for coffee, and all of them for cakes, so the hobbit was kept very busy for a while. A big jug of coffee had just been set in the hearth. The seed cakes were gone, and the dwarves were already starting on a round of buttered scones when suddenly came a loud knock. Not a ring this time, but a rat-tat on the hobbit's beautiful green door. Somebody was banging with a stick. Bilbo rushed along the passage, very angry and altogether bewildered and bewildered. This was the most awkward Wednesday he had ever remembered. He pulled open the door with a jerk, and they all fell in, one on top of each other. More dwarves. 4 more dwarves. And there was Gandalf standing behind them, leaning on his staff, and laughing. He had made quite a dent on the beautiful door. He had also, by the way, knocked out the secret mark that he had put there the morning before. "Carefully, carefully," he said. "It is not like you, Bilbo, to keep friends waiting on the mat and then to open the door like a pop gun. Now, let me introduce Bifur, Boffer, Bomber, and especially Thorin." "At your service," said Bifur, Boffer, and Bomber, standing in a row. And then they hung up 2 yellow hoods, and a pale green one, and a sky blue hood with a long silver tassel. This one belonged to Thorin, an enormously important dwarf. In fact, he was no other than the great Thorin Oakenshield himself. And he was not at all pleased at falling flat on Bilbo's mat with Bifur, Boffer, and Bomber on top of him. For one thing, Bomber was immensely fat and very heavy. Thorin indeed was a very haughty dwarf, and said nothing about service. But poor Mr. Baggins said he was sorry so many times that, at last, Thorin grunted and said, "Pray, don't mention it," and stopped frowning. "Well, now we are all here," said Gandalf, looking at the row of 13 hoods, the best detachable party hoods, and his own hat hanging on the pegs. "Well, it's quite a merry gathering. I hope there is something left for the latecomers to eat and drink. What's that? Tea? Oh, no, thank you. A little red wine, I think, for me." "And for me," said Thorin. "And raspberry jam and apple tart," said Bifur. "And mince pies and cheese," said Boffer. "And pork pie and salad," said Bomber. "And more cakes, and ale, and coffee, and if you don't mind," called the other dwarves through the door. "Put on a few eggs, there's a good fellow," Gandalf called after him as the hobbit stumped off to the pantries. "And just bring out the cold chicken and pickles." "Seems to know as much about the inside of my larder as I do myself," thought Mr. Baggins, who was feeling positively flummoxed, and he was beginning to wonder whether a most wretched adventure had come to his house without his knowledge. By the time he had got all the bottles and dishes and knives and forks and glasses and plates and spoons and things piled up on big trays, he was getting very hot and very red in the face and annoyed. "Confusticate and be bothered, these dwarves," he said aloud. "Why don't they come and lend a hand?" Lo and behold, there stood Balin and Dwalin at the door of the kitchen, and Fili and Kili behind them, and before he could say knife, they had whisked the trays and a couple of small tables into the parlor and set out everything afresh. Gandalf sat at the head of the party with the 13 dwarves all around, and Bilbo sat on a stool at the fireside nibbling at a biscuit. His appetite was quite taken away at this point, and he was trying to look as if this was all perfectly ordinary and not in the least an adventure. The dwarves ate and talked, and time got on, and at last they pushed their chairs back and Bilbo made a move to collect the plates and glasses. "I suppose you will all stay for supper," he said in his politest unpressing tones.
"Of course," said Thorin, "and after. We shan't get through the business till late, and we must have some music first. Now, to clear up."
Thereupon the 12 dwarves, not Thorin though, he was too important, and he stayed talking to Gandalf, the rest jumped to their feet and made tall piles of all the things. Off they went, not waiting for trays. They balanced columns of plates, each with a bottle on top, with one hand, while the hobbit ran after them, almost squeaking with fright. "Please, be careful! Oh, please don't trouble! I can manage!" But the dwarves only started to sing. Chip the glasses and crack the plates, blunt the knives and bend the forks, that's what Bilbo Baggins hates. Smash the bottles and burn the corks, put the cloth and tread on the fat, pour the milk on the pantry floor, leave the bones on the bedroom mat, splash the wine on every door, dump the crocks in a boiling bowl, pound them up with a thumping pole, and when you've finished, if there are any are whole, send them down to haul the roll. That's what Bilbo Baggins hates, so carefully with the plates. And of course, they did none of these things. And everything was cleaned and put away as safe as quick as lightning, while the hobbit was turning round and round in the middle of the kitchen trying to see what they were doing. Then they went back and found Thorin with his feet on the fender smoking a pipe. He was blowing the most enormous smoke rings, and wherever he told one of them to go, it went. Up the chimney, or behind the clock on the mantel, or under the table, or round and round the ceiling. But wherever it went, it was not quick enough to escape Gandalf's smoke rings. Pop! He sent a smaller smoke ring from his short clay pipe straight through each of Thorin's smoke rings. Then Gandalf's smoke ring would go green and come back to hover over the wizard's head, and he had a cloud of them about him already, and in the dim light it made him look strange and sorcerous. Bilbo stood and watched. He loved smoke rings, and then he blushed to think how proud he had been yesterday morning of all the smoke rings that he had sent up the wind over the hill. And that's where we'll end today. Thanks for joining me. Hope to see you all here tomorrow.